Resilience Reimagined, Dean Speaker Series, Dean of the Embry-Riddle Worldwide College of Arts and Sciences, which is me, in case you were in any doubt, Alexander Siedschlag, and we are very excited. And as always, feel free to post your questions on the chat with a brief sentence about yourself as a courtesy, identify yourself. And then as the presentation moves forward, but you can also take opportunity of the Q&A time that we specifically have reserved, as always, at the end of the session. But you can also, as I said, go ahead during the presentation and post your questions. So the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction defines resilience as the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate to, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through the preservation and restoration of its essential basic structures and functions. Our speaker series hosts esteemed guests once a month to discuss fresh perspectives on a broad range of resilience topics. The series supports our college's strategic vision to be a true destination college for multidisciplinary studies and impactful collaborative research as we strive to transform our students and the broader community into responsible global citizens. Now, resilience in the US is part of the or connects to the national preparedness cycle that is composed of the segments of prevent, protect, mitigate, respond, and recover. And that's recover. That's where today's presentation falls. And now let me welcome Joshua Barnes, who is the manager of disaster response of the Disaster Response Coordination System, or DRCS, in that project office within NASA's disaster program. In his role, he leads the coordination of NASA-wide efforts to use the best available science, technology, and expertise to aid decisions of those working in operational disaster response. He is a highly experienced emergency management and community development leader with demonstrated success working with federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, nonprofit, and private sector leaders across the country in deriving solutions to complex challenges. Joshua formerly served as Recovery Director of the Office of Disaster Recovery and Resilience at the U.S. Small Business Administration in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he led the Recovery Division in the Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, and served on the White House National Security Council staff as the Director for Preparedness Policy, as well as served as the Economic Development Administration Disaster Recovery Coordinator, leading interagency efforts to coordinate information sharing, technical assistance, and resource leveraging to support major and catastrophic disasters nationwide. As Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University defines itself as an institution of higher education in the field of aviation and aerospace, is it very appropriate, and it's exciting that we have a NASA representative here who obviously speaks for himself. But Joshua, you will probably start with that disclaimer. So welcome virtually to Embry-Riddle. Thank you for your time. Take it away. This is your group. Thanks everybody for coming.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I very much appreciate the kind introduction. Wanted really, first of all, appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all this afternoon and have the opportunity to kind of talk through some of the things in which NASA is doing in the disaster response space, as well as would certainly welcome any thoughts or questions or even ideas about ways in which we can help improve these processes moving forward. I do have a few slides. I'm just going to provide a little bit of context about what the program is, what it does, and how we are responsive and supportive of states, tribes, territories, countries, both domestically and internationally after disasters. So there is the NASA disasters program is fairly broad. It has three main portfolios. Just to give a little bit of context. The first is our disaster applications portfolio. I'll talk about some of those projects here later in the presentation. But really, what that fundamentally is some of the grant and investment work that NASA does in trying to improve the science of how we look at these hazards and look at how humans adapt to dealing with these hazards. The second component is where I'm the manager of, which is the disaster response coordination system. It is our effort to try to harness and leverage the full suite of capabilities that NASA can bring to bear to support the disaster response community. And then lastly, the final main component is our disasters portal, which is a free and open access uh, uh, ArcGIS uh, uh, web service platform that anyone can access. It follows consistently with NASA's open science and open data policy. So whenever we are activated for a disaster, we will be posting all of our bespoke products to that place, and I'll talk more about that here in a few slides. But it's also where we host a lot of NASA's real-time products as well. So that can include some of the other capabilities that are across the NASA enterprise. Speaking of which, there we go. So one of the things which we really have a key benefit of as part of being part of NASA is that we have a really robust um, uh, what we call the Earth fleet. So this is all of the satellites that we have currently in operation. This graphic shows the time frames in which they were launched, and also those that we have planned in the coming years. Um, we also have different instruments that are stationed on the International Space Station, which we're able to tap into. And not featured here are also some of the partnerships and contract agreements that we have with some of what we call our commercial small sat partners. So that's um, companies like Planet and Maxar and others who have privately held satellites that are in orbit that are continuously providing both optical and synthetic aperture radar or SAR imagery to support uh, really any of their customers, NASA being certainly one of them. One of the things that I did want to start out with, though, is that when we're talking about resilience and disaster response in the context of Earth observations, which is really where the nexus is of what our work is focused on, is really trying to get at asking the right questions. And so this is something which it's not so much a academic academic exercise. It's not a research question that we're trying to ask. But what we find oftentimes in the post-disaster environment is that there are lots of organizations that are interested in trying to be helpful and supportive and useful in meeting the needs of impacted communities, survivors, states, countries, organizations as a whole. And so, but it's important to delineate what may be some of the wrong questions. And it's not that they're wrong in that they're bad questions or that they're the wrong things to ask, but maybe it's just the wrong way to ask it. Because asking things like, "What are your unmet needs?" or "Do you need more of X commodity?" Or "What barriers or issues do you have?" Or what imagery do you need? Usually, the response that you'll hear is um, uh, coming from a perspective of general sense of being overwhelmed, and that they're overcome with. They are the typically the disaster responders and the local officials. They are overcome and overrun with requests and requirements, and they oftentimes don't know what they don't know. And that may be stating it fairly simply, but one of the ways in which we can be better stewards and better supporters of that community is to ask better questions. And so some better questions with the space perspective in mind are things like trying to really narrow in on what are some of the things that we would anticipate that they would likely need, but then also ask them about ways in which we can um, find out what it is that they may be looking for that may be useful, but really align it to what their current state of operations are. So looking at things like, instead of asking what kind of imagery do you need, instead maybe a better question is, does your community need additional damage assessment data? And oftentimes the answer to that question could be yes, it could be no, but if it's a yes, it's likely going to come with a more precise insight into, yes, we don't have any real clear visibility on what's going on in the more rural areas or the more remote areas, because it's more difficult to get access to those locations. So trying to ask the right questions that kind of meets the stakeholder, meets the partner, meets the response organization where they're at is really a critical part of one of the things that we need to do, both from a, a science perspective, but also really when in the space in the area that we operate in, we're really trying to build a bridge between the disaster response community and the scientific community. So it's typically not helpful to be showcasing and highlighting and kind of blasting them with all of the great and amazing science and imagery and other things that we find are particularly fascinating. But really, the thing that we need to focus on is really asking the right questions and really fundamentally listening to find out what is it that needs to happen next, from their perspective. What are their pinch points? What's burning up their inbox right now? And then listen to and be responsive to what those things are. Sometimes there's something that we can do about it. Sometimes there isn't. But it's oftentimes I found that it's in kind of the in between spaces where there may not be a direct request that are that those disaster responders and the community officials and state officials and international partners are dealing with, but it's kind of hearing kind of the side pieces of those issues and topics that they are struggling with, but may not they may not have fully manifested how that could be made into an actual express request. And so it becomes important to really be a translator and be a bridge builder between what their needs are and what it is that we can deliver from our agency's perspective, but really from wherever you're coming from, whatever capabilities, whatever assets you have to bring to bear, you have to really put yourself in their shoes and meet them where they're at, as they say. So I mentioned one of the key components of the NASA's disasters program is the disaster response coordination system. What this is that it is it is a request driven model. So it is something where when a disaster happens, we are not in a position where we are like I alluded to earlier. We're not blasting and pushing data products out to the impacted communities, and instead we are doing a lot of trying to do a lot of the work before the disaster to make sure that they know what is available to them, but then also being in the room, or being connected with the disaster response community to make sure that that as the needs become known, we're able to be supportive of that. And so one great example is that we're actually currently activated for Hurricane Beryl, in support of the Texas Department of Emergency Management. One of the things that they are really focused on, and this is an active issue as of this morning, this afternoon, is that there's roughly 1.3 million people without power in the greater Houston metro area. And so one of the things that I'll touch on here in a few slides is that there are tools and resources that we can provide that can give them some additional data and hopefully actionable data and information to support their decision support systems. Central to what the disaster response coordination system is really all about is it's trying to leverage what we call a one NASA approach. This is in contrast with what can happen organically, although it's not necessarily always a bad thing. Where if there just so happens to be, let's say someone in Florida happens to know that, oh, Josh Barnes works at NASA. I'm going to email Josh and ask him for help with this hurricane or this flood or this wildfire that we have going on in the state of Florida. And odds are Josh Barnes will do everything he can to be supportive and try to connect that person in Florida with what he knows is available. Um, but that approach tends to be somewhat ad hoc and is not always benefiting from the full scope of the research app, applications and capabilities that are across the entire NASA enterprise. And so you can find actually there's a big stage launch event where we had had the NASA administrator and other senior leadership and interagency partners highlighting it roughly a month ago in Washington D.C., highlighting that this is the direction that we're taking as an agency, where we want to make sure that not only are we request driven, but we are trying to find a way to really bring to bear the best available science to support and build those bridges to connect them with the disaster response community as a whole. What's featured here in the map are the main NASA centers that are involved with this system. So each of these centers have an earth science programmatic and research component in it, which is why they're focused there. Um, uh, and then I'll move on to the next slide here to focus more on kind of the nuts and bolts of how the system works. Really, what where it centers is that it uses a hub and spoke model to try to bring together the capabilities of each of the respective Earth science programs and centers that are across NASA to look at the Earth observation data, the subject matter expertise, the information that can be useful to really fundamentally support what are some of those post-disaster response and coordination and inquiry needs. And so whether it's just getting access to imagery, whether it's getting access to finding out impacts to infrastructure, understanding risks to human health, or other areas. Really, what we lean on very heavily is the network of subject matter experts that we have, and and they're the scientists who are doing the on the ground work. Um, that we're looking to apply towards post-disaster response and recovery and resilience support. So, just a few examples that I'll pick on with some of these centers because I'm not sure how familiar you all are with what each of these centers does. Each of them has a different set of specialties, and so. One example is that with the Johnson Space Center, one of the things that we will often be working with them on is getting geo-referenced photography from the astronauts that are on the International Space Station. So this is something which is quite helpful in that as the International Space Station flies over a given disaster area, we're able to add it to their task list, and they take pictures, and we're able to integrate them into our geospatial context to then see what is the broad view about what's there, what's available, and that's going to be independent of whatever other satellite assets are going over. Some of the capabilities we have at Goddard and the Marshall centers are really focused on some of our capabilities around the meteorological disasters. So uh, weather-related hazards, landslides, things of that nature are similarly, we have similar capabilities at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and at Langley. which is where our office is based out of. We also have scientists who have expertise in looking at things like uh, air quality and what's in what what is in the air, what are the particulates that are in the atmosphere, what is the composition of the atmosphere, but then also too, what are some of the other hazards like uh, volcanic hazards, seismic hazards, things of that nature. So really casting a wide net so that depending on what the hazard is and where it's located throughout the world, the idea is that we're able to tap into the best available science. So, speak to this fairly briefly about kind of what the process is. The barrier to entry is to get NASA involved is deliberately low, because we want to make sure that we are putting that best available science forward to support the disaster response community. So fundamentally, what how it works is that we get a request. Oftentimes that can come through email, it can come through other means, but generally it is a user-centric, user-driven approach. Our team will then review it to see whether or not it is something which we can support. Is it something? Are they asking a question that we have the science and the capabilities to be supportive of? And in some cases, there are going to be really clear, really um, um, uh, plain to see connections about how NASA science and assets and resources can be applicable to support that. In other instances, we'll be looking to actually turn them and refer them to some of our partner agencies because there's a lot of different um, organizations that are active in looking at these hazards and understanding them from a science perspective. So to the least of which being, of course, NOAA, USGS, USAID, and other organizations. And then once you go internationally, you start to canvas a much wider net of national space organizations as well as those, um, as well as other international alliances. Um, Once we then decide that and determine that there is something that we can provide a value add product on, we'll then activate the system. We then post that to our disaster portal. I'll have the link on the slide here in a few moments. And essentially, everything that we produce, whether it's some of our near real time products or some of the bespoke products that are created specifically in response to the question that was asked, will be posted there. And then we'll basically follow up and try to have a continual conversation with the requester to make sure that we answer the question that they had, and then see, are there any follow-on requests? Is there anything additional that needs to be done? And then ultimately conduct an after action assessment and try to continually improve the process that we have going forward. Excuse me. Using last year as an example, um, these are some of the areas in which we were active. This is actually before the DRCS was spun up. This is where the disasters program was active in it. And one of the things that I'll two of the things that I'll note on this slide in particular is that we are truly a multi-hazards operation where we're looking at everything from hurricanes and cyclones to flooding to earthquakes to wildland fires, volcanoes, you name it. There is if it's a hazard and it's an issue that can be observed from space, and it's something that is affecting infrastructure or people or the ecosystem, then that's likely something that we're going to be able to provide some kind of value add proposition with. Also, the next thing that I'll zero in on here is our stakeholder involvement in that a lot of our constituency, a lot of the folks who are asking for our assistance, um, the majority are other federal agencies, and so that's because they are the lead operators. They're tasked with leading the operation for the disaster response for a given incident. In other instances, we have specific states that will reach out and ask for assistance. We'll have national level nonprofit organizations, whether it's the Red Cross or the World Central Kitchen or other organizations, and then other countries will then reach out as as well, seeking additional assistance. Get a few examples of some of the ways in which we've been active recently. So following Hurricane Ian, we did a lot of work in trying to isolate and really help the state of Florida and FEMA and the NGOs that were operating there get a better sense for where the inland flooding was from Hurricane Ian. So one of the biggest advantages of having Earth observations is that we get to see the entirety of very large land masses. And so using the both the optical as well as the SAR imagery or the synthetic aperture radar imagery, we're able to get a sense for what the full extent of the hazard is. We also have other tools called Black Marble. It's looking at the night lights. So every night there is a satellite that passes over every part of the world and is capturing all the light that's being emitted from the Earth's surface. And so this is really helpful in a post-disaster environment. One of the things we've that I'll dive into here in a couple slides here too, but it's something which can be really indicative of power loss. So we can look at the before and after to get a good sense for that. Also, we were responsive to the California atmospheric rivers that happened both in 2023 and in 2024. This was helpful also with the state of California for their emergency response to understand just the sheer. I mean, California is a large state, so there's a lot of land area to be concerned about, and so getting a bird's eye view, so to speak, of where all the water was, where all the localized flooding was something that was of great concern and great interest for them. So we were able to use some of the some of our assets for supporting that. And then also looking at the supporting and the Hawaii wildfires in 2023, one of the interesting things and that we were able to do was not only provide the optical imagery about what was burning and where it was, and look at some of the sensors also tell us what the temperature is of where there are heat anomalies on the surface of the earth, which can be particularly helpful when you're looking at tracking wildfires over large and remote areas, but also using some of that SAR imagery to really look at the before and after um, imagery to derive what we call damage proxy maps. So that's essentially taking the pre-incident um, imagery, so that when the radar signal goes down to the surface of the earth, it bounces back, and then that creates a set of a data set that then um, can be processed. Well, after a disaster, things change. Buildings can be destroyed, trees can be blown over, so that the surface of the earth changes. And so the satellites are sensitive enough, and the surface aperture radar is sensitive enough to detect those changes. And so that's one of the things that we use in our damage proxy maps, is to help them then identify areas that may have increased damage over others. In a similar way, we can also use this to illustrate the different seismic hazards. So um, this is where we can look at the actual movement of the Earth. So we know that the position and the orbit of the satellite is not changed, but we know that after an earthquake, we know that the land has moved. We know that has changed, and so we can use some of that data to then understand this that the surface of the Earth is now further away from the satellite or closer to the satellite, depending on what's happened, and so that can be really illustrative to help complement the other data sets and sources that are derived in looking at some of the seismic hazards. There's a lot of really robust tools and resources that can be brought to bear to measure this more on a more granular level. And so one of the things that this is really helpful for oftentimes is in helping to prioritize and target some of those ground-based data validation and damage assessment teams to help prioritize the areas that they're going to focus on more. And it also helps to then ground truth whether or not some of the things that they're observing, if there wasn't data about the pre-disaster data, then we may have some of that available through some of the Earth observation data on our side of the equation. Another incident that I've alluded to that we did respond to back in May, and we're actually doing very much the similar response now for Hurricane Beryl, was that there was back in May in the greater Houston area, there was a derecho that rolled through the region, caused a massive set of power outages. Over a million customers were out of power. And this is problematic from a lot of perspectives, but what was a cascading hazard with this was that there was a heat wave that came immediately thereafter, and it created a very serious public health concern for a lot of the residents in the area, in the greater Houston area. So one of the things we were able to do was we worked with FEMA as well as with some of our state and local partners to find some of the before and after imagery from our black marble or our nighttime lights data resources. And so you'll see in the image in the upper right, that was the baseline from April 2024, and then you can see right after the storm rolled through, significant pockets of where the actual power was out. And so that was on May 18th, and then as the days progressed, you can see the areas of darkness begin to re-illuminate, and so you can see the power getting slowly restored. One of the things that we also did, which was somewhat novel, because mostly because we hadn't been asked to do it before, was that there was a concern, given the public health ramifications of the extreme heat coupled with the power outage, was an understanding what are the areas of greatest vulnerability. So cross-referencing the data that is on the left side of the screen, with some of the pre-disaster data of understanding social vulnerability, to get an understanding about, okay, based on the power outages themselves, what are some of the areas that may require additional assistance more than others from a life saving sort of perspective. So we continued that analysis, and extended it to also include some of the Department of Health and Human Services Empower data. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not, but it is a data set that captures all of those who are on Medicare or Medicaid that utilize durable medical equipment that is dependent upon electricity. And so naturally, if the power is out, that is going to be of a particular concern for those at-risk populations. And so what we were able to do was to then cross-reference the power outages based on the Earth observation data with some of these public health and social vulnerability indexes, to then help FEMA and the state and local officials in terms of prioritizing areas that may be of greater concern than others. So instead of recognizing that, again, Houston is a large area, the Metro Houston area is a large area, finding ways to help narrow that search and prioritize some of those resources is one of the things that we were trying to be helpful with. So I mentioned before that we have also the disasters mapping portal. This is the main platform that we use to post the data that we produce when we're activated after an incident. It's also where we post. We have a series of near real time products that we have on that is available for things that are NASA assets that they can refresh depending on when the satellite passes over, or when the instrument passes over. Some of them are updated hourly, some are updated daily, some are updated less frequently. But really, once that data is made available, there's a live feed into our disaster mapping portal. And the portal itself is designed to not only be open access, but you can also pull it into whatever geospatial or GIS environment that that the end user is hosting, whether they're using an Esri product or QGIS or other tools. The web service that's created is generally agnostic in terms of what application it's being ingested into. I mentioned some of the near real-time products, just a few that I'll mention. This is a bit of an eye chart, so would suggest that if you are interested to go peruse some of these on the website themselves. But some of them I already mentioned are some of the black marble imagery, as well as the global landslide nowcast. Flood detection observations. We pull in some of the precipitation accumulation numbers that are observable from some of the uh, satellites that are in orbit. These are really useful, generally in terms of gaining some general situational awareness about what's going on in a given region. And because they're near real time products, they're updated pretty frequently, and which is nice. And there's also a global coverage for most all of them. The biggest disadvantage with this is that they do have a coarser resolution. So we're looking at things that which they may not have a 1 meter or 10 meter or 30 meter resolution. They could be at 250 meter or 500 meter or 1 kilometer resolution. So it's not going to be as precise as perhaps one of the more bespoke or more targeted and tailored products. But it's something which again is intended to provide the disaster response community with the generalized situational awareness about what to expect and about what's going on. The last part here that I have is mentioning some of the disaster science to action. So this is our applications. So this is the actual research that we do and we fund. It's fundamentally intended to support the advancement of disaster science and technology. I did want to highlight a few of the projects that we've funded before, looking at landslide risk and exposure modeling. So this is where we've been utilizing some of the capabilities and tools to integrate both with the Pacific Disaster Center or PDC. So they pulled in the algorithms and the data that were developed as part of this and they've ingested it into their tools. And really, it does serve as one of the first global models for rainfall triggered landslides and can provide some early warning for those communities that are particularly affected by those kinds of hazards. I already mentioned we've made a lot of use of mapping flooding with the synthetic aperture radar. So this is something which is um, seen to be quite useful, especially when we're talking about the more remote areas. But also one of the biggest advantages of synthetic aperture radar is that it can see through clouds. And it's something which, especially after a major rainfall event or a hurricane, there's a lot of cloud cover, and so getting some visibility about what the water extent is and what the impacts are, utilizing some of this imagery can become quite useful. Also, we have the ability to look at some of the early warnings about where there could be hailstorm risk, and so this is one of the things which we can observe actually by looking at the temperature of the surface of the cloud tops themselves. So when we're studying the actual storm clouds and the storm tracks, we find that there's quite a bit of um, confidence in looking at where the radar patterns are with where the temperature changes are in the clouds themselves. And just to um, put it simply, is that when you have hail that is being generated quickly, it's going to get thrown up higher into the atmosphere, which generally makes the cloud colder, and we're able to detect that. And so as it gets colder, we're then able to detect where that hail formation is actually occurring, and then able to then map out where it's going to be falling to the earth, causing damage to property as well as crops and other things that it may be hitting on its way down to the surface. Um, Also using some of our LiDAR and other remote sensing capabilities, looking at helping aircraft avoid volcanic ash risks. So we're very much engaged in working with both the FAA as well as other organizations. They're through a collaborative called the VACS, or the Volcanic Ash Advisory Centers. There are several of them that covered the world, and they are regularly monitoring where there's volcanic activity and where those volcanic plumes are going to potentially cause impacts to air travel, and that's particularly of concern in the polar regions, because there's a lot of transcontinental and rather intercontinental travel that goes circumpolar, and so looking at finding ways to look at the SO2 um, concentrations for human health, as well as looking at the ash concentrations to see what is the risk and what is the hazard to people, as well as to aircraft that may need to go through a given airspace. And then the last project that I wanted to highlight here is that we also have, through some of this, I've mentioned it several times, through some of the SAR data. One of the really fascinating things with is looking at the ability to map um, o- oil spills. So we can oftentimes you can see oil spills visually from space. But one of the advantages also with the synthetic aperture radar is that, as well as it can penetrate clouds, it can also go several meters into the water. So we can get a sense for how deep the oil actually goes, which can be really helpful for those who are in the oil spill cleanup uh, and 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 disaster response, to get a sense for not just the breadth of where the oil slick actually is, but also how deep and potentially how much volume might actually be involved in it. So a lot of this research that we do, and a lot of the applications of what we do, is really geared towards focusing on improving the decision support about what and how our disaster response community can be supportive of the post-disaster response needs. And so really that's the last that I have. Wanted to include the contact information. There's our website. Um, we're very eager and very open to seeking out partnerships and engagements about ways in which we can improve the connections with the disaster response community, as well as the academic community, and also find ways in which we can help build those bridges further, because we're of the firm conviction that there's a lot of great science that's being done out there, but people just don't know what they don't know. And so it's really incumbent upon us to help build those bridges and meet people where they're at. And then if you're inclined, we air the big launch event for the DRCS on NASA TV. The URL is there, or you can just YouTube NASA TV's live feed, and you can see see the footage of when it aired on June the 13th. And then you can scan the QR code here too, if you're so inclined to sign up for our newsletter, and you can get regular updates. And with that, I believe I'm done. Yes. Happy to take any thoughts or questions or reactions.
Wonderful, Josh. That was so insightful and comprehensive. This is great, and thank you for also to NASA, for the interest in continuously learn from others, and to expand the enterprise and the network. So that is what research is all about, to open it up. And you are really setting an example here that is great to see from the perspective of an institution of higher education. I see we have a couple of internal as well as external participants here, so I think we are going to have a pretty good discussion for the remainder of the time here. So who wants to start? Who wants to break the ice? So we have one question from either Steve or Shirley. So maybe everybody knows you basically, but if you could also put a sentence about yourself in the chat as a courtesy. So what are the charges or cost recovery policies? That's the question here, the first one.
So if I'm reading into the question accurately, the core question is how much does all of this cost? It's free. So it's freely open and available. What we're trying to do is really um, build off of existing science and existing investments in that science and really put it to use. And in the somewhat rare instances in which it's going to require additional analytics, additional data collection, additional effort, then there would be some kind of cost involved with that, which we would have to kind of cross that bridge when we get to it. But by by and large, we want to really exhaust the capabilities of what's already out there because it is free, basically.
Makes a lot of sense. And that was a question from Cal State, California State University at Long Beach. So it's great that we span the country here with our attendees today. So and you're welcome, Steve and Shirley. Who wants to be next? So this is of particular importance to us as we at Embry-Riddle, as we have a globally distributed Master of Science program in Human Security and Resilience, in addition to an Emergency Services Master's program. So this is very insightful, and we will also, of course, use the recording, if we may, in our courses in these programs. So Keith Earnshaw, who is a faculty colleague here at our college, expressed his appreciation. He was an evacuee from during Hurricane Florence from Bald Head Island in North Carolina in 2018. So quite an experience there. We don't envy you for that, Keith, but thank you for sharing. And you're apparently still around, so this is good. What is, Josh, if I may ask, what's the next frontier for NASA with supporting recovery? I mean, you say still, I mean, there's still a way to go in really putting to optimum use all that's out there and available at no cost to officials and communities within and to, a whole community framework. So that's great. But what's the next frontier for disaster response support for NASA?
So that's a great question. So I think that the next frontier is really and this is one of the main it was one of the main goals that we had with having a pretty widely publicized launch event and why it's on YouTube is we wanted to kind of put in a open for business sign up to make it clear that disaster response is something that NASA does because typically when you hear of NASA you think of space shuttles and rocket ships and landing on the moon and Mars and things like that. But we also have a lot of capabilities that are looking at the Earth, and so we want to really increase the awareness of that. And the hope is that as a next step is that as more parts of the community um, and mean the term very broadly, the broad community become aware and engage with us and start to use this data, that we get feedback about what's working, what's not working, how can we improve it. We are we are a research science agency, and so we're constantly trying to innovate and trying to improve on the things that we're providing, and so fundamentally we want to be again meeting folks where they're at, and so I think it's going to be looking at how we can both improve the data delivery, the data products, the kind of expertise we have available, but then also on the long tail have that inform future satellite missions, so that if there's a particular data point or asset that would be phenomenally helpful and make a huge difference in how folks are able to respond to and recover from disasters, then there's a continual information flow to help inform what those needs are. And so we want to keep that flow active with what the disaster response community needs too.
That is great to hear. That is wonderful. And because we are all part of the whole community, this is great. And we see a special role also, like I said, even for institutions of higher education. And then obviously this connects to Embry-Riddle particularly well, but is relevant to everybody, also Cal State, who does work and research and also action research in that area. With that, as we are approaching the hour, are there any additional questions or comments at this time? Yeah, this was really fantastic. So as there's nothing else coming up, Josh, once again, let me thank you so much for your time and for your presentation. We are looking forward to editing and sharing the recording. Thanks to Brianna, as always, for arranging and organizing and taking care of all the technological aspects connected to that. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody for attending. We'll be back, to those who have signed up to follow us, with an announcement for the next occurrence in August. So stay tuned. But until then, have a great summer. Be good and be safe. And once again, so much. Thank you so much. That has been so insightful. Very much appreciated, Josh. Thank you, and take care, and bye-bye.